Okay, so I'm really pleased today to welcome Carmel Gentle. Welcome to.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
So I am a qualified midwife. I've been a midwife for almost 14 years, and I've worked in various roles within the NHS. I'm based in London, and so part of my last role that I was in the NHS was infant feeding, and there I supported women on the postnatal ward after they had their baby, and would generally be kind of called in where there were complex feeding issues, where they were struggling to establish breastfeeding. And
Mhm.
so I'd go around, and it was quite a nice role because I didn't have a case of women I would see kind of for the whole shift, so I could just go in and
Mhm.
spend that time with them and really help support them for a good 1 to 2 hours or however long it was needed, and I could go back and review. So I really enjoyed that role, and was part of achieving the baby friendly standard for the hospital. So it was a nice role, and it kind of led me into what I do now.
It
And
did.
whilst I was there, I and now I support women breastfeeding in a private capacity. But so I go to their home, and I see them at home. And I also started up a tongue tie clinic whilst I was still at the hospital, and so that has kind of transitioned to where I am now, working privately and supporting mums at home,
Thank
dividing their tongue ties.
So, when you do support new mothers, what are some of their most common worries?
One of the biggest worries that I hear time and time again is that they feel they don't have enough milk. Um, and they have a lot of concerns or anxieties around whether their baby is getting enough, and how to know that they are feeding well, how to know that feeding is going well. So um, by supporting them in kind of first understanding, what it feels like to have their baby latched onto the breast, and then observing so that they can observe when I'm no longer present, is the suck swallow breathing pattern that occurs. And so they can listen out for when their baby is swallowing, and plus listening to seeing how well their baby kind of settles after a feed, and the wet dirty nappies, as well as weight gain. So that the milk, having enough milk, is probably their biggest concern. And the other one, I think, is that they never realized how challenging it would be, how challenging breastfeeding would be.
Mm.
And I think a lot of their focus antenatally is that they're preparing for the birth, and then when breastfeeding comes, it's quite a big shock for some people, and they
It
feel a
is
bit
it's a
overwhelmed.
really tough gig, isn't it? Because people
Yeah,
may often think what's natural is going to be easy.
exactly. Yeah, and so there's this kind of idea that the baby will just go on to the breast, but actually there's so much more to it, and so many other factors that can impact it. And so I think that comes as a big shock to both physically and also mentally as well. And it can be quite traumatic for some women. So it's getting that right support, the right advice in those early days to really help support them on their journey.
So, you talked about many mums being worried about low supply. In your experience, how much of the time is that something that has happened, and what would be the reasons for low supply? Because obviously women are built to make milk for their babies.
Yeah, so it's very rare. A very small percentage of women will not be able to produce milk for whatever reason. Usually, it's a kind of physiological reason why they can't. But for the vast majority, they will, their body will go through that process where it prepares milk. It's preparing milk very early on antenatally, whilst they're still pregnant, and then through birth the right hormones come into play, and their milk comes in, and they increase. But one of the biggest things, I think, where there are so many challenges that occur with feeding, their supply can be very quickly impacted. And so if they have to introduce a supplement for whatever reason, or they've been advised to, or sometimes incorrectly advised to, then they can start to decrease their milk supply. And then they become kind of almost focused on how much then from a bottle, so it's easy to measure, and then they don't trust that they're able to do the same from their breastfeeding. And so there's this anxiety that comes in again. And but from my experience, and the vast majority are able to produce enough milk from the onset.
So, what would be important in getting breastfeeding off to a good start?
I think there needs to be a lot more focus on the antenatal preparation. And I think if women were better prepared, and also, expected it to be challenging, and that it's a learning journey. You know, they're learning, their baby is learning, and it just doesn't happen instantly for most people. And so really learning antenatally what it is that they're looking out for, looking, you know, going through the books, researching everything they can about breastfeeding, a bit like they do with their birth. Kind of compare it to kind of a getting married. And so, you know, you prepare for this really big day and you put all the preparation, but then you've still got the marriage afterwards, where, you know, you're preparing for this big day event of your, you know, your baby being born, and then you've got the baby afterwards. So it's really preparing for that breastfeeding experience, and it doesn't happen overnight. And so getting as much knowledge, I recommend creating a little kind of a toolbox of resources and support, speaking to friends and family who've breastfed, and, you know, hear what their experience is like, because I think you can get kind of caught up. You see kind of women who've maybe gone past that challenging period, and you see them just popping their baby onto the breast, and it appears to be quite easy. And everything we hear about it is that it's so natural, and, you know, babies are born to breastfeed, and so there's this assumption that it's just going to happen. And so I think if there's much preparation they can do antenatally, then they're gonna, you know, it just sets that foundation for starting.
And maternity nurses would often be living in the home with the family, sort of working 20 hours out of 24 with a family. How can they best support mothers who have chosen and indicated that they would like to breastfeed?
To really learn as much as they can about breastfeeding, actually, because that's, you know, that's going to be critical, because if the mum might be asking them for their advice, and, you know, does this look right? Does this, you know, is this how it should feel? And so if they first understand, well, actually, you know, you shouldn't be experiencing pain, then they're going to be able to best advise, well, actually, no, maybe something's not quite right. Even if they don't know what it is that's not right, that they can then say, well, perhaps you might want to look into getting some extra support, or directing them to the local support networks, or asking them, you know, reminding them to speak to their midwife. So yeah, so they might not know exactly what it is, because they might not have done that training, but if they know that just kind of a few things about breastfeeding, that, you know, one, it shouldn't hurt, the baby should be satisfied after most of the feeds, the wet, dirty nappies, how much they're expecting, and you know, they can then really best support the mum in finding the right support as they face challenges, if they do.
What myths about infant feeding do you often hear, both breastfeeding and formula feeding? What commonly do people have in their heads?
That your nipples should toughen up. That's just not true.
Do you want to explain why nipples don't need to be tough in terms of what's happening when the baby feeds?
Yeah, so if the baby is latched well, so we're kind of looking for a wide and deep latch, the baby's latched well, the nipple will be in the right position in the baby's, mum's nipple will be in the right position in baby's mouth, and so the nipple will reach the soft palate, and in that space there's no chance of any friction occurring. And when the baby's on a shallow latch, or baby loses the latch, so might appear to go on wide and then starts to slip down, the nipple's then sitting in the hard roof of the mouth, and when that happens, there's constant friction happening, which will start to wear or tear the mum's nipple, which will cause her pain. The other thing is, if their baby is unable to latch well, or there's a tongue tie in place which could be restricting the baby's tongue mobility, the baby has to find a way, or they'll compensate and find a way to keep the latch. And so what they often might do is then clamp down with their gums. So they're trying to keep hold of the latch, and so this clamping down of the gums causes pain, and often mums will refer to it as, it feels like my baby's got teeth. And so you know then that the baby is biting down, and again, that's not quite right. Something needs to be assessed in order to see what else is going on. And so, yeah, no, definitely. And a sign of that happening is, even if the mum doesn't maybe report pain, because she might feel like, okay, this feels quite comfortable, she might be on painkillers that be masking some of the pain. If the nipple is coming out misshapen, so like a lipstick, a new lipstick, or flattened, really squashed together, or elongated, so it's been stretched, then that's a sign that the latch isn't quite right. And so it'd be a red flag for looking into what's going on or getting extra support.
What other myths do you come across?
Some of the other myths, that the mum is just, again, it's similar to the pain one, that the nipples are just sensitive. Again, that's a sign of pain. It's not quite true. Something is going on. That the baby's just got a short tongue. So again, that might be, you might not be able to see the baby poking its tongue out, and that could be a sign that the baby's perhaps got a frenulum, which is the kind of band underneath the tongue. Could be a sign that there's a tongue tie, and so would be a red flag. If you think, oh, the baby's just got a short tongue, it might be that there's a tongue tie stopping the baby extending their tongue. The other ones about kind of breastfeeding is that mum's nipples are too flat, so the baby's not going to be able to latch, which again isn't true, because we're not expecting the baby to just latch onto the nipple. You need to get the breast tissue into the baby's mouth. So it can sometimes impact how the baby can latch, but they are generally able to latch, and there's other strategies and kind of tips and tricks that can help support that. So again, if they're not in a position where they're able to support with that, it's getting the right support in as soon as possible to help mum establish feeding. But formula can fill the baby up for longer, and so that can impact on, if the mum's choosing to breastfeed, that can start to impact on her supply, and the supply can start to dwindle because the body's not getting that supply and demand response, so it doesn't know to produce the milk, so it will have to naturally reduce that supply over time, and then the mum can be kind of stuck in a position where she has to keep on topping up with formula or giving formula as the baby has growth spurts and she can't meet the baby's needs. What else? The milk in the first 3 days isn't sufficient, so the colostrum isn't sufficient for the baby, and so top up is then required of formula, and that, again, those really kind of good nutrients that the baby's missing out in those early days, and it really sets the pace for breastfeeding. So it's a complete myth that it's not enough for the baby, and if the baby is latching well, you can hear them swallowing, they've got good wet dirty nappies, and that's a good sign they're getting what they need, and mum should be encouraged to do so. And that, again, I guess the bigger one, which is what also the mums worry about, is that being told they don't have enough milk. If they've been told that they don't have enough milk, that's going to plant a seed in their mind that they don't, and they'll start to believe that they don't, and then they won't be able to trust that their body is able to do it, and so that will just set them off onto a kind of downward spiral. So it's really not helpful.
We hear a lot from people who are concerned about having low milk, and they're often advised to have things like lactation cookies to help boost their milk supply. I can see you smiling there. What's your view? What in your view is the best way to boost supply?
It's getting that right support from day one, day zero, the day the baby's born. If they can really get off on the right footing, that's going to set them off on their feeding journey, because I think when you're having to bring in lactation, we have to look at birth as well, because birth has a big impact on how breastfeeding will start. And I think, if baby's been separated from the mother, if there's been a huge blood loss, there are other factors that can impact feeding. But in a case where there is no concern, or there's no, everything seemed to be straightforward, when you're starting to introduce lactation cookies, oats, and fenugreek, these are kind of trying to, you've got to look at what happened, where did things change, what happened in the early days with the baby needing to start formula early on, or for whatever reason. You've got to really go kind of work backwards, and they may help down the line if it's needed, but you've got to really start off in the right place to really get the best chance of getting it right, and so you're not kind of backpedaling then to try and up the supply when the supply may have been fine in the very beginning. And so it's getting that support. And I think again, going back to the antenatal period, when those signs of maybe feeding might be going wrong or not going in the right direction, then getting support in at that very early stage, the first moment it's noticed, because that can really save time. It's time that's lost, and that's when the milk supply will start to dwindle, because the body's protecting itself. It can't just produce milk ongoing if the baby's not going to be taking it, or if you've got the baby drinking formula or anything else. So yeah, it's definitely, that support is needed.
So, talking about mum, obviously we need to make sure that breastfeeding mothers are well looked after for themselves, their own well-being and health. But do breastfeeding mums need to eat or drink anything special?
What I say to mums is eat. They spent their pregnancy worrying what they can and cannot eat. Eat what you want in moderation, and I think everything in moderation, unless they're seeing a direct correlation with what they're eating to how that's impacting their baby, when everything else had been okay and maybe they've introduced something new, or they can see a direct correlation, then again it's looking at is this really is it really true, for starters, or is there something else going on, but you're just kind of it's a coincidence. But yeah, I think I say eat what you like in moderation. I don't think they need to start having any special diets or anything like that. Nothing, to boost their supply. Eating well, feeling, they will feel well because they'll have the energy, and just keeping hydrated, because they're giving off a lot of fluid when they're feeding, so they need to replace that fluid. And they often feel quite thirsty when they're breastfeeding. So they'll naturally ask for water, but just keep encouraging them to, keep hydrated when they're feeding. But no, eat what they feel like they want to eat.
And what do you wish that families knew about infant feeding, either breastfeeding or combination of formula feeding? What would you love every family to know?
I'd like them to know that it is difficult. It really is difficult, and but at the same time, there is lots of support out there. I think they need to be mindful that it is full time. Their baby will demand a lot of them, and that is something that's going to be quite a transitional period for them, because they're used to just having, this their first baby, it's just them, and so now they've got this little being who wants them all the time, and it impacts them, physically, mentally, emotionally, and so it's a transitional time. And if they can get all the support and know where to get that support antenatally, that will really help them in that early postnatal period. I think if I started to identify again antenatally who it is that they would support, who they would call out for support, and just write like a checklist of the people that they know that they can reach out to, even have a chat with a lactation specialist antenatally, so that they could just have a conversation, talk about their plans, like they make a birth plan, make a plan for feeding. I think a lot of mums that start formula feeding, who want to breastfeed, they end up doing it because of some of the challenges that they experience. So, really kind of making a plan or a little guide. Okay, so if this happens, what would I do? Like a step-by-step kind of plan, and troubleshooting guide just for themselves, because it's going to be so different for every family. And so if they had this discussion early on, they can really feel prepared for that if the time occurs after they've had their baby. And then if they are choosing to bottle feed or combination feed, it's if that's their choice from the beginning. Again, if they've done all the research, they'll be fully informed on what their choices are, what they want to do, and what they want that to look like for their family. So if they are planning to bottle feed, then it's looking at what type of bottles there are, what sterilizing equipment means and how it works, so you're not 2 o'clock in the morning panicking on how to put this thing all together. I think talk about in paste bottle feeding, which is something that's kind of being heard a lot about.
You'll be demonstrating that on part of our course.
Yeah, because paste bottle feeding is a really good way to just slow, because a baby will just guzzle it. A bottle flows so easily, so it's just kind of letting the mums kind of watch videos antenatally, so that they can see, okay, this is how, because I think a lot of people, when I've talked about, I thought you just give the bottle.
Demos of paste bottle feeding.
And so just really learning about that and what that means. And yeah, I think the biggest one, I think for me, Anthony, whether they choose to bottle feed, breastfeed, combination feed, is having a chat with somebody, either your midwife or the breastfeeding team if they have one in the hospital, or having a conversation with a lactation specialist. I know lots of women do go to, they might have like a breastfeeding course within their antenatal group, but despite that, they're still feeling the struggles afterwards. So I think having a one-to-one discussion just to really kind of lay out what is their desires, what are their goals for feeding, and having some clear, precise steps that they can follow once their baby arrives.
So from your point of view, for an average infant, of course, there is no such thing as average, but for a normal newborn, what does feeding look like over the first 2 weeks? How frequently would they be feeding? What should mums be preparing to expect?
So is this for breastfeeding or for?
Yes, fully breastfeeding.
For fully breastfeeding.
So
breastfeeding, so they would, from the beginning when their baby is born, ideally, if all goes well with the birth, they've got that protected time once their baby's born, skin to skin contact, and they will start to see when their baby is interested in feeding, and you're kind of learning early on, kind of looking out for the feeding cues. And so babies are, they're very instinctive, and they are born wanting to feed, and so they'll start to show you feeding cues on when they're ready to feed. And so it's looking for the rooting, the sucking of the hands, and kind of the head turning. They're trying to search for their milk, and so having that time early on, and then having a good few feeds in those first 24 hours. So the baby might feed every 2 to 3 hours initially. Often they'll feed frequently at night, and nighttime is a time when mum's hormones are increasing and prolactin increases, and so the baby is often quite nocturnal, and they're ready to feed, which goes quite against the body clock. But having that support, if they've got a maternity nurse, and having that support to kind of really encourage baby to keep feeding through the night, because that's when the body's going to start making more milk overnight. And so it can feel quite erratic sometimes. There's no real schedule, there's no plan in those first early weeks, but every time the baby is going on to the breast, they're just telling the body to increase the milk supply, and they're switching on the milk making cells, which are going to really help to maximize the milk supply. So those first 2 weeks are really crucial. And so it's feeding the baby kind of responsively. So responsive feeding is what's recommended, so that you really kind of up the supply to what your baby needs. And then after the first kind of the 3 days, your mum's milk will start to come in, and so they might feel quite engorged. Just transition from that colostrum to the mature milk, and they'll feel quite full. The baby will start to get more volume. And so where the first 3 days may have felt like the baby was constantly feeding, or feeding, very short intervals, things might start to settle a little bit, and there might be a little bit more of a rhythm that they see. And so the baby might then start to feed every 2 to 3 hours, and that's from the beginning of one feed to the beginning of the next. And this is completely normal if the baby is feeding as frequently as that. So they might have between 8 to 12 feeds in a 24-hour period. And again, it's quite key that, particularly that cluster feeding. So cluster feeding is where the baby just wants to feed for about 2 to 3 hours, or longer sometimes, or longer. And that can be any time in the evening. Often it's in the evening, could be from around 6 p.m, 7 p.m, when the milk from the mum's hormone, is starting to increase. And it's really important that cluster feeding period is not disrupted, because that's the time when the baby needs to feed, and that also telling mum's body to make more milk overnight. So it's really, really crucial that is allowed to happen, assuming that the feeding is going well and the baby is transferring the milk effectively, and the other feeds throughout the day have been quite rhythmic. There's been a bit of a gap between it. If the baby's doing this constantly, then that might be a red flag that something isn't quite right. But if this feeding's been going well, suddenly they're starting to feed a lot in the evening, let them feed, the baby will settle eventually. But it can be a time when often they thought, oh, baby's not feeding, they must not be feeding, and so the top up is then introduced, and that will start to disrupt the flow of mum's milk. And so, yeah, those first 2 weeks can feel a bit out of, you feel like you're kind of sink or swim, but it can be quite erratic time, and it's a lot. Mum's recovering from birth. There's a lot to take in, a lot to learn, but it does start to settle. I say kind of it really kind of establishing that kind of natural breastfeeding takes at least 8 to 12 weeks.
Yeah.
It's a long period, and it's a time, you know, that mum is learning loads, baby is learning, baby's growing. So you feel like after the first few weeks, you kind of feel, okay, you're in a bit of a rhythm, then a growth spurt happens and things are kind of gone off again. And then, you know, 6 weeks, another growth spurt happens. And so it's a bit up and down. And it's just, I think from a maternity kind of nurse perspective, it's reassuring the mum is, you know, looking out for any signs that something's not quite right, but reassuring the parent that, you know, this is completely normal and it will start to settle, and just kind of really protecting that time when the baby is latched well, to do what they need to do in order to get what they need.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to talk to you.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.